My name is Ben Page. I'm the manager of Ipsos in the UK and Ireland, and I also lead on some of our work on global trends, which is what we're here to talk about today. This is a study that we have been running every 3 years. It's enormous, but it looks at how human societies and consumers are changing. We'll post all of these slides with you in due course, or at least the highlights from them. If you have any questions, you can now ask them in the question box on the app, or by all means email me, ben.page@ipsos.com. So let's dig into this. The survey is, of course, designed to help us understand what might happen in the future. But the first thing I think to remember about predictions is that most of them are wrong. This is just two examples of this. There's a friend of mine, a guy called Tom Peters, who wrote a bestseller in the 1980s. And this book was called In Search of Excellence. And Tom was the management consultant. Everybody bought this book at airports. It told you about how to copy the best companies in the world. And within 3 years of publishing this book, 1 in 3 of the companies in the book were either bankrupt or in severe financial difficulties. And I think what that just reminds us is that human beings actually aren't very good at predictions. There's a huge amount of uncertainty. I love this one here. This is a guy winning an Oscar in 1924. So he knows all about the film industry. And he says, when a century has passed, all thought of speaking pictures will have been abandoned. We will never be able to synchronize the sound, like I'm talking to you now, with the picture. We'll never be able to do it. They did it 2 years later. So even experts are not very accurate. I mean, pollsters like me, and indeed my colleagues in the Netherlands and in Holland, are actually often very accurate, but only a few days before an election. But generally, when you look at expert predictions, this is people in banks predicting what will happen to American Treasury rates. The line going down is what actually happened. The lines on the chart show the forecasts. And as you can see, the experts were generally predicting that they would go up, and consistently they went down. So again, whatever field you look at, human beings generally not very good at predictions. If you look at what people say are the biggest threats to health, this is in this study, the Global Trends study. We asked people last year when we did the field work, what would be likely to kill them, and they were most worried about cancer or diabetes, not eating the right food, or pollution. And only 4 people in 100 said something like COVID-19, influenza, malaria, AIDS, etc. So again, people are wrong, and we know that. But on the other hand, there are things we do know. So what Global Trends does is ask 370 questions, and in the half hour we have today or so, I am not going to try and brief you on all of those. You'll be pleased to hear. It's 22,000 people. It's 33 different countries. So if you want to compare the Netherlands with Montenegro, or the Netherlands with China, or the Netherlands with Britain or Peru, you can. We can do all of the questions are asked in all of the countries pretty much, except a few questions in Saudi Arabia and China and Russia we don't ask because we don't want to go to jail. But everywhere else we ask the questions. And the survey is based on a theory of change that includes the coronavirus. And so we know that there are macro forces in the world, whether they are technology, climate change, that drive changes and trends in human society, which is what we're measuring here. And those, of course, then manifest themselves in signals that we can see in our daily lives when we walk around Amsterdam or walk around London. So macro forces are the known knowns. They are the things that are going to happen. We can be absolutely certain about those. Predicting human trends is a bit more difficult, but even there, I hope I will show you that there is quite a lot of certainty about some of those. And the signals, of course, are those very quick changes, sometimes superficial, that we can also measure. And our approach is to measure all 3 of these things. And if you look at the report on the website, written in February, it includes the coronavirus. But to give you an example of how these might work, climate change, of course, is affecting human societies in all sorts of ways. It's leading in one way into an interest in plant-based food and a shift away from eating meat, not just for health reasons, but also because people are concerned, particularly younger people, are concerned about the meat production and its impact on the environment. But a signal in that would be, in my country, a bakery called Greggs. They have branches everywhere. starting to sell, instead of sausage rolls, a bread roll with sausage in it, they now sell vegan sausage rolls. That's a signal. But of course, it's driven ultimately by climate change. So those are the three components that we're measuring. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the trends. The macro forces we don't need to spend a long time on because you know them, but it's a good reminder because these are the known knowns that are going to fundamentally change our societies. So dynamic populations, migration, the aging of Europe. Europe will be the oldest continent on Earth, even without COVID-19 or with COVID-19. And we know that different countries will change dramatically. For example, we know there will be more Nigerians than Americans in just a few years. We know the Italians will be extinct. There will be no more Italians in 170 years unless they import some people or Italian women finally decide that they want to put up with Italian men. We know we have growing inequality and opportunity, and we'll talk about that. The gap between different parts of Europe, between different parts of the world, or even within countries, is getting bigger, and that's causing tension. We have moved away in terms of geopolitical relationships from the world of the late 20th century to a world of China as a global power, now fighting America in a sort of Cold War, Europe fighting Russia, tensions in a way that were not present 30 years ago are now here. Data, I'm not even going to talk to you guys about because you know all about it, but of course it's changing our world. And I think the other thing the other thing to watch out for is technology tipping points. And those are, of course, the way technologies come together to make massive changes. And so one technology on its own, global positioning satellites, does one thing. When you then add in the internet, that does something else. When you add in smartphones, suddenly you can have Uber and you finally completely disrupt traditional taxi services. But it's how those three technologies come together. And fragile planet, of course, is one of the biggest trends. We saw massive fires all over Australia, massive flooding in Europe. And of course, now COVID-19 is another symptom of the fragile planet that we have created. And one of the evidence is that the planet that we are creating, and now human beings mold the planet as much as the planet molds us, is that we will expect more pandemics like COVID-19, partly as a result of climate change. So those are macro forces we know about. COVID-19 is a massive shock to the ecosystem, and we can see already massive potential disruption, although we need to be very careful about saying that the world is going to change forever. If the virus disappeared tomorrow, and we all, it's very likely that many things wouldn't actually permanently change. And so we need to be quite sensitive about that. And I'll show you why in a minute. But at the first time, we do have, of course, a massive set of signals that we can see. So, society is sometimes becoming more caring. My street, where I live in London, and it may be the same for you, hundreds of people on a WhatsApp group now talking to each other and asking if anybody needs any help shopping. That type of thing. In Italy, they've got balcony bingo and exercise classes all over the world. Supermarkets are reserving the first hour of opening for older and vulnerable people to decrease pressure on them and to stop them being pushed out of the way by healthy young people. We've got a rise in escapism and online behaviours. So Pornhub is now free. Premium Pornhub is free all across Europe for the first time. China, gaming growth was up 30% during lockdown. In Europe, we saw the Xbox site crash as countries went into lockdown and people just sat at home playing computer games. We've got all these sort of crazy confrontations, people saying that the virus came out of a laboratory in Wuhan. We found that 25% of the British think that is true. We've got people saying that this is all boomers' fault. People like me, I'm 55, and I didn't care about the planet, and now I'm going to be wiped out by the virus. Good riddance. And maybe we'll see changes in American healthcare, where with 30% of people uninsured, we will see the consequences of that, and maybe a permanent shift. And then, of course, bad science, the idea, the conspiracy theory that 5G, the rollout of 5G, is actually causing COVID-19. And some famous actors tweeting that. So, you can see all of these signals out there. But just a reminder what Global Trends is all about. There's a website which I will show you at the end. You can download the report and look at some of the details in there. What we do in the survey with those 370 questions, we ask the computers to use factor analysis to map out the different questions and identify values that we can see across human society. And what we're doing here is showing you those 36 values, and these are assembled in terms of the associations by the computer. So on the left, you've got more conservative values. On the top, you've got more open values. At the bottom, more closed, and to the right, more, and to the left, more conservative values. So, for example, here, a cluster of values that you can see common to voters, perhaps, who vote sometimes for Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen. For Brexit in Britain, they share the values of populist revolution, being against the elite. They are worried about the future. They feel left behind. They share the value of nostalgia and feeling overwhelmed, lots of data anxiety, and also concern about technology. Over here is probably the values of many people on this call. These are values of people perhaps who actually think that capitalism, it has its problem, but it sort of broadly works. Pro-globalization, think that globalization has been good for growth, positive about technology, into data sharing, early adoption, bit of Insta shopping, often wanting to try and live in a different country, the value of nomadic aspirations, and generally believing that medicine, you should take the vaccines, you should trust medicine rather than trust conspiracy theories. Here are the values of perhaps Donald Trump or Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil. These are the values of traditional nationalism. We must defend the nation in tough times. Environmentalism is all, and flooding is all it's all a hype by the media. Believing that men and women should know their place. Women have different roles to men. They shouldn't try and be like men. Also, wanting to shop offline, don't necessarily believe the doctors, but also believe it's all about achieving, getting on in life. Over here are the values sometimes of kids, but also millions of people around the world, much more radical. So we've called one of them beyond binary. These are the values of people who very strongly believe in gender equality, who very strongly believe in trans rights, but also in LGBT rights, and who believe there are more than two genders. There may only be two sexes, but there are more than two genders. There are all sorts of shades of grey, from male, female, and something in between. And then with that, and close to that, but a long way away from the traditional values and nationalism, is the value of climate emergency, real concern about climate change. And that is the thing that in the survey as a whole has the highest level of consistent agreement across the world. But interesting about, at least in terms of there being a problem, if not in terms of the solution. And in here are some really interesting things for brands: discerning consumption, individualism, make where you get your food, provenance mattering, conscious eating, eating the right things, this sort of set of values around yourself, looking after yourself, taking control, aspiring to health, thinking carefully about what you buy and eat. So those are the 36 values. We can break those down for individual countries. You can look at them for younger versus older people, rich people versus poor people. We've just done, my colleagues in the Netherlands have produced this chart for me, which just compares the British and the Dutch and where we map out compared to the global average on some of these values. So here are the British as I'm doing the talk. So we're about average on hedonism. In terms of liking other countries, xenophilia, we're a bit low. Some of us voted for Brexit. Not sort of average on globalization, average on fear of the future, early adoption, individualism, we're sort of average, brand worship, pretty average. Traditional gender roles, we're anti that. We think, gender equality is important in Britain. We're not particularly into materialism and achievement, and that's true for a lot of Europeans. We don't think, unlike people in Indonesia, India, and China, that that you will do anything to get ahead, to get rich. In Europe, we're a bit more, we have good welfare systems, and we're just like, there's more to life than making money. Regulate big tech. The British are a bit more keen than the global average. Review-based consumption, Insta shopping, and pretty much the same. Climate emergency, we're like everybody else. Trust in medicine a bit higher. And populist revolution, we're pretty average. Here are the Dutch. So you're really hedonistic, among the highest in the world on that. It's almost as though you just want to forget everything and have fun. I noticed massive queues outside shops selling weed in Amsterdam when lockdown was announced, as everybody got ready to be locked up with their marijuana. Xenophilia about the same as the Brits, so we're both not so keen necessarily on other countries. Pro-globalization, again, like us, you're a bit lower. Fear of the future, you're less worried than the British are about that, and you're less into having the latest things and brand worship than we are. Traditional gender roles, you're even more into gender equality than the British are, and very different, you'll find, than, say, Russia or Indonesia. Materialism achievement as well, yeah, you're almost like hippies, actually, even less enthusiastic than the British. Regulating big tech, sort of okay in the middle, I guess, not much there. Review-based consumption, so much. Insta shopping, nah, they're not going to be obsessed about Instagram. Climate emergency, and I was interested in that. You're less anxious about climate emergency, and I was trying to understand that. I don't think the data's wrong, but it may be that you have been prepared for things like rising sea levels for a very long time in a way perhaps that other countries haven't experienced. Trust in medicine a tiny bit lower, and populist revolution, you and Denmark and Sweden are really not into that in a way that Britain and America are, and France is. So, and in fact, in the study, you have some of the higher levels of trust in politicians, still not that high, but certainly a lot higher than in many other countries. So really interesting about how you can look at individual countries' values in the study. But anyway, what we've done in the study is take all of those 36 values and group them together into 12 trends. And I was going to talk about some of those trends in the report, because we can't write up 370 questions for 33 countries in one report and have anything you would actually want to read. We've gone through each of the 12 trends and talked about what they mean for business. But we've called one climate antagonism, because although climate emergency, which we'll come to, is a real thing, there's also a kickback against it. We've got conscientious health. I think it speaks for itself. For all of you who are all about brands and FMCG, then this is the one for you. Authenticity is king. Where do people get things from? Their views on the importance of brands and indicators. We'll come back to that. And I'll talk about how we measure the values. Somebody's asking, we'll talk about that at the end. And then we've got two around data, which are also strong trends. Both data dilemmas. We love all our online lives and all of our apps and our smartphones. The average person in Europe born after 1995 is spending 24 hours a week staring at this small screen, 24 hours a week just looking at that, sometimes doing other things at the same time, and but also worried about privacy. So we'll come to that. Peak globalization we've looked at, and where people come in on wanting to close off or open up. And again, it will be interesting to see if that changes as a result of the virus. We've got a divided world where we look at some of the clashes in values around things like trans rights, or even the kickback from some men in Europe around gender. One interesting thing about the Dutch and the Danes is that they think that they're far more liberal in terms of, say, sexual abuse than, or sexual harassment of women than they actually are. So Danish and Dutch women report far more sexual harassment than Danish and Dutch men think is actually happening, for example. So even a society that is much more egalitarian, perhaps, than Britain, there is still some work to be done and tension there. We've then looked, of course, at capitalism's turning point. Even before the coronavirus, there was a debate in society about whether or not we need to stop capital having all the money. Since the 1970s, if you look at the world, people who own assets, the capitalists, are getting more and more of the economy going to them, and lay people who work for a living, like me, are getting less and less of the economy. And so wealth redistribution is actually one of the strongest areas of agreement among people globally. But there's some hope for capitalists in the survey too. We've then got reactions to uncertainty and inequality. So if we're feeling unpressured, how do we react? Because one of the things that Europe shares and America shares is the loss of the future. So the country I know best, where I'm sitting today, in Britain, before the crash, only 12% of us expected our children to be poorer than we are today. After the crash in 2008 and now, it's 45%. So people are expecting their children to be poorer than them. And that is a massive psychological shift. And reactions to that sometimes are to retreat to the past. So we talk about the enduring appeal of nostalgia, to go back to the past when everything seemed fine, because the future, of course, is so uncertain. Another reaction is to find somebody who will tell you they will fix all your problems. So a populist solution: vote for Donald Trump, he'll fix all your problems. He knows the answer. Vote for Marine Le Pen, they will stop those evil capitalists from doing you down. And then, of course, another reaction is just to find a way out, the search for simplicity and for control and meaning. And one of the things that we know is that people, whenever you do the survey, to be honest, want their lives to be simpler. They want to feel in control. If you're a brand and you can give them that sense of control, whether it's for you curating things for them, just making things frictionless, like Amazon has done so brilliantly with the Alexa speaker and the Echo speaker, making it easy and simple. And then finally, because healthcare is such a huge area, we did this long before COVID-19, we've got choices over healthcare, whether people search for autonomy, but also a lot more and more data about themselves. So those are the 12 values. And I thought I'd talk a bit about these and also how they may change with COVID-19. But I think a key point is that, and this is why I'm still talking about this survey today, it's an enormous data set which we can make available to you. And the reason why we think it's relevant is because although the study was undertaken last year, although we are, as you will see if you go online, we are mapping on new signals from COVID-19 all the time. Trends in human society and values change very, very slowly. Belief in the death penalty, believing that gay men and women should be allowed to get married. These things don't shift overnight. In a sense, what we measure at Ipsos is both values, which are very deep and slow changing. We measure attitudes, which change a bit more, perhaps like a tide. And we measure opinions, which are, what did you think of what was on television last night, which is almost like the surface of the sea and is constantly changing. And just to give you an example of that, this is a chart showing you Britain and what has changed in Britain over the last 20 years. And I just picked out 4 values that we might expect to have changed quite dramatically. We've been doing the study in Britain since the late 20th century. So since 1999, internet penetration has risen from 13% to 93%. We have 9/11 and the war on terror. Facebook comes along. The 2008 crash means a real freeze in real wages for about a decade. In Britain, I don't know how it was in the Netherlands, but in Britain, the freeze in real wages was as long as the recession after the Napoleonic Wars, and it was the longest freeze in real wages we had experienced for over 100 years. But in that time, the proportion of people who said they wanted to slow down the pace of their life didn't change at all. The proportion, even as Facebook and Amazon Alexa are launched, who say technical progress is destroying our lives, doesn't change at all. The proportion who say it's important to be a CEO and become a big boss doesn't change at all. And the proportion who say actually it's up to us to work out our principles to guide our decisions just doesn't change at all. So some things just literally don't change. And it's important to know which of the values that we're measuring are likely to see lots of change, but also to know that many of them will not change overnight, which is why I want to talk to you about some of these today. So when we look at the 36 values, what I've done here is rank them according to how strongly people agree with each of the values. We don't need to look at this in detail. What's interesting is that fear of the future, even before COVID-19 and the recession or even depression that Europe may experience this year, was very, very high up in people's values. It is this partly as a result of the crash of 2008. We've seen lots of people who were not expecting the next generation to be better off. Our whole way of thinking about the world was under pressure. And that, of course, has led to populist revolts in many European countries. And I think also sometimes in the Netherlands. But also there you can see climate emergency is very, very high as a shared value globally. Further down, you've got things like regulating big tech. You've got discerning consumption quite strong there. Those are some of the stronger ones. Down here, Insta shopping, faith in capitalism, data sharing, somewhat weaker values. But these are all still values that, coming out of all of those surveys, are things that we can identify as trends in society. So if we take one of the 12 trends that we looked at, we called climate antagonism, it's interesting to sort of unpick that and to look at some of the contradictions in human behavior. And I can't play you videos on this platform because it just doesn't work that well for me. We tried earlier and it didn't work. But it's interesting to see that you've got general agreement among humanity that climate change is a result of human activity, that we're heading for disaster if we don't change our habits, that companies don't pay enough attention to the environment. 2/3 of us say it's important to move to electric cars to stop polluting, although interestingly, our neighbours in Germany are the least likely on the planet to agree with that. And in fact, more of them disagree than agree in Germany. I think because they like producing petrol and diesel cars and BMW and Daimler and Mercedes and selling them to the Chinese. But anyway, it's interesting to see how this varies by market. Sometimes the differences between markets are bigger than anything you might expect between different regions of the world. But at the same time, of course, if we've got 80% saying we're heading for disaster, we've got 47% globally who say scientists don't know what they're talking about. And I think this is partly because the media like to bring on TV the scientists telling you about the threat from climate change, but then perhaps to show there's also an opposing voice, they bring on another expert who says, yes, but it's overrated. And the trouble is 96% of scientists agree that climate change is definitely happening and it's man-made. And only 3% of scientists think, well, maybe it's just a fluctuation and it's, it will go away. But the end result is the public end up very confused indeed. And we can see that in qualitative research. So it just shows that people want leadership on this issue. They sort of know it's a problem. They want companies to do more. And but at the same time, of course, they want us to make it easy for them. The brands need to do things, but make it easy for them and perhaps sometimes gently nudge them. Another key set of trends that we've seen are what we've called data dilemmas. That's one trend. And the other one is the tech dimension. And so you can see this sense that we're going to lose privacy because of what technology can do. You can see a real feeling that social media companies have too much power. And Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook is saying, actually, we need to be regulated. And yet at the same time, people say this, but they're all happily using all of these platforms. Zoom has become, absolutely everywhere, and yet it's not, it's not safe. The data for Zoom until earlier this year was actually being routed through China, where I'm sure the Chinese government was having a good look at it. So, we want to regulate big tech, and there are some signs that fear of technology is on the rise. I find it harder to switch off, 52, 56, 60 since 2013. Technical progress is destroying our lives. Again, it's gone up a little bit globally. It's sometimes stronger in the markets that are seeing faster change. It's strongest among the youngest in the world, not the oldest in the world, interestingly, the people who actually are really spending all the time on their phones. But at the same time, we also have data apathy. First of all, we've got people recognizing that technology makes life better. And actually 2/3 of us saying, although scientists sometimes do things they shouldn't, we need tech to solve future problems. And although we've got these concerns about technology, at the same time, we've got rising apathy. So more people saying, well, it's inevitable the government will just be able to read all my emails. I don't bother knowing what data people are collecting about me. I just use the devices. And younger people in particular are more and more, in some ways, desensitized to it. So you've got this sort of tension in people's minds. It's important if you're a brand to not do awful things with people's data, but they seem, despite their anxieties about it, they seem to be embracing it nevertheless. And as I say, more and more people actually are expressing data apathy, which is why we created it as a value, because it seems that they are just becoming resigned to the fact that, real privacy is not possible anymore unless you don't use any technology at all. We look also at peak globalization in the study. And one thing that's interesting is that when you look at globalization being good for you, obviously China, India, Indonesia are at the top. Interestingly, France and Britain and the Netherlands rather less enthusiastic on just agreeing with the statement, globalization is good for my country. So quite big differences. But even in China and India, what's interesting is that individuals, and it's the same in the Netherlands and the same in Britain, individuals are less likely to think globalization is good for them personally than it is for the country. And it's one of those reminders of the tensions. But we are actually seeing in the survey rising support for globalization. So generally people agreeing that we have more that unites us than divides us. The French, for some reason, think they're very special generally, but overall most people globally think that we have more in common than divides us. And overall globally, despite populism, despite Donald Trump, we have a gentle rise and a proportion agreeing that globalization is good for my country and the 20 markets that we have been tracking in the series since 2013. Capitalism's turning point, I think, is a really interesting one, particularly as we come out of COVID-19. We're already seeing criticism of companies paying dividends when they are also laying off workers or furloughing workers. And it's true that one of the things that comes out of the survey is this underlying anger towards the system, thinking that wealthy people should pay more tax. Having gaps in wealth between rich and poor is bad for society overall. And 3/4 believing that the economy of my country is rigged to help the rich and powerful. And even in Sweden, which has the lowest figure in the world, from memory, I think that figure is 54%. But in countries like Mexico, it's nearly everybody. So this real sense of inequality and wanting capitalism to be fairer. And that reflects in the West, that squeeze on living standards that we've seen since the crash. People expect business to speak up. Sometimes it's painful if you do, but Nike have shown how it can work. We've got a responsibility to speak out on the issues affecting the country. And whether you're Gen Z or a baby boomer like me, or a millennial or a Gen Xer, it's pretty much the same globally. We want business to speak up. And actually, interestingly, although we are critical of capitalism, you can see that most people globally say that if you work hard, you can get ahead. Not quite so true in Italy. In Europe's a bit lower down here. Netherlands and Britain, we're very similar here, just here in the middle. And the Peruvians, Chinese, Colombians, Indians up here. So most people saying that, yeah, despite everything, if you know, the system does actually pay back if you work hard. So maybe capitalism isn't going to collapse at the moment. And actually, in separate work that we do tracking populism, and it's the same when you look at the detail in this survey, populism has actually been going backwards slightly for the last couple of years in Europe and in America. And overall, most of us say that we think brands can make money and do good at the same time. And of course, we want to see brands doing that. Brands, of course, behave completely differently on this than they did when I was young. But younger people, of course, really want to see that happen. And so a key value is this sort of sense of authenticity as is king. You know, you can see it in the proportion of people who say that they want to buy brands that reflect their personal values, particularly strong in developing markets. There is Britain in the middle there. The Dutch and the Danes a bit lower, you know, just not even interested in brands perhaps, but really, really big in China and India, that wanting to get the car, wanting to buy the clothes, the things that really reflect you. Everybody everywhere saying that their own personal experience with a brand matters more than advertising. And of course, human beings always say this. We know, we can prove, and you know that advertising works, but people would rather say, of course, it's actually about their personal experience. They would never be swayed by advertising. But thinking about that experience, those touch points, how do you make sure that everything you do reinforces the brand rather than damages it? One of my clients at HSBC, I said, well, what are you trying to do? He's the guy's in charge of marketing at HSBC, and he says, well, I'm just trying to stop my colleagues doing things that damage ultimately the brand. That's all I do every day, is try and stop them doing things that damage the brand. So personal experience really matters. And then, of course, and there's hundreds of other questions around brands in the survey, but I haven't got time to show those now. Another thing is just nostalgia. It's been around a long time, but it's got stronger and stronger. So people believe, wrongly, that young people today have shorter attention spans than in the past. You know, they can't remember anything, these young people. There is no truth. There is no truth in that. We've got half the population, though, globally, saying they want their country to be the way it used to be. The way it used to be. So we don't know if the Americans who believe this, the 6 out of 10 Americans who think this, do they want to go back to when slavery still existed in America, or maybe only back to the 1950s when there was racial segregation? But I think actually most countries don't want to make homosexuality illegal. Again, in Britain, when I was born, it was illegal to be gay in Britain. Today in Britain, 66% say it would be fine if Prince Harry had married a man rather than marrying Meghan Markle. Meghan Markle might have been happier if he had married a man, but people don't care. And Britain and Holland, actually, Britain and the Netherlands, together we are the most liberal on the planet about our attitudes to homosexuality. We are most likely to say that gay men and women should be able to live their lives exactly as they like. However, in Britain, at least, we've got a large proportion of people who say they want the country to be the way it used to be. And it's this, that just reflects that sort of level of anxiety. It's lower in the Netherlands, but there it is, 50% globally. So the past is always with us. And another reaction to all of the uncertainty that people feel is this sense of how we find meaning in life. It's why yoga is taking off online during the crisis. But even before the crisis, the best-selling apps on the iPhone App Store were all about calm, meditation, and we've got 2/3 of people nearly saying they want their life to be simpler. Again, to be honest, humanity always wants its life to be simpler, but we do have more ways to distract ourselves, and we do have more choices in how we live our lives than ever. So we've got 63% saying that. And one reaction to uncertainty, which the Dutch certainly seem to embrace, is to say, well, I don't know about the future, but the key thing is just to have a great time today. Tomorrow will take care of itself. It's certainly true that in lockdown, I've personally found, because I can't leave this house, I've personally found this a pretty good idea. Let's just get through the day and have a really good dinner. And who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. But it's another reaction. And again, globally, that seems to have been rising even before the crisis. So we are tracking all of these values, and you can dig into all of them. What we're now doing, and you can see this if you go to the website, is using the framework that we've built up for the study to spot changes that may start to emerge from COVID-19 and the behavior changes that it's imposing on our societies. So, some of the trends that we can see, if you look at climate antagonism, we've got, this is an article in the New York Times, you're doing social distancing, but you might be fighting climate change too. We've got these people saying it's not okay, boomer, using this to be even more radical about the need to finally act on climate change. So does us noticing that the air is better, suddenly it's more breathable, do we wonder whether actually the virus is a way of telling humanity to slow down? Will we see, as we come out of this crisis, actually people saying we need to take stock as a country, we need to reflect as a country about whether we go back to commuting and driving every day to work, or do we decide that actually we can move to a simpler sort of existence? We need to use this as a way of really reflecting everything we do and deciding, do we want to change? There are some signals here then that we're measuring that might suggest that would happen. At the same time, the evidence from the 2008 crash was that as a result of as we came out of the 2008 crash, pollution levels shot up again, everybody starts flying again, driving around, so we don't know. Authenticity is king, I think, is one where there is some evidence that traditional brands will benefit, and brands with purpose. We've seen General Mills deciding to spend a lot more money advertising Cheerios and it's traditional brands, because the idea is that at times of uncertainty, people want to go back to the brands that they remember from childhood. And in terms of brands with purpose, we will remember those brands like Bavaria Beer, who switched their production lines into things like sanitizer. We'll remember that LVMH or Chanel stopped making perfume and started making sanitizers. So again, who comes out of this well? Will we go back to traditional brands during the crisis and then stay with those brands? We know that in terms of shopping behavior, after we have bought all the toilet roll we need or could ever need, we will gradually use that up after lockdown. But in terms of buying lots of tins of food and pasta, there is some evidence that after the virus ends, we will be used to always having in our store cupboard lots of tins. And so you will see a permanent increase in certain sorts of food consumption. So we'll see. Another key one is governments. This is the Chancellor in charge of the money in Britain, a young man called Rishi Sunak, Donald Trump here. These governments now all over Europe are spending money in the way that they normally spend it during wartime. And that means a massive increase in the size of the state, people having their salaries effectively paid by government in a way that we have never done for decades. Will we see, therefore, a much bigger government in future in countries like Britain, but perhaps also in France, Germany, the Netherlands? In America, will citizens finally say we need a healthcare system that is more like the one in the Netherlands than the one that they have at the moment, where 30% have no health coverage at all? Will we see then a system where actually there are very high taxes to pay for all of this intervention or not? We just don't know. Nostalgia, will we see, we've got a massive increase in sales of games for people to play and puzzles. We've got, traditional family meals, of course, being forced on us, but actually does that, and particularly with the income squeeze that looks to be, will be around, companies won't be doing big pay rises anytime soon now. Will we see, as we also saw after the 2008 crash, a nostalgic return to simple pleasures, to knitting, to making things at home, doing, and again, an appraisal. Do I really need all those fancy new gadgets, or actually, shall I just stick with these things I have? Shall I do more things with my friends and family? The tech dimension, well, we have technophilia as a trend, and one we can see a massive surge in internet use, in streaming use, etc. We've got also, of course, pressure to regulate big tech, but more monitoring than ever. It may be that in order to conquer the disease, because the vaccine will not be available potentially for another year until next summer, if we are to be released, we will need to have a system more like Singapore or China in Europe, where your status is known about in terms of whether you've been exposed to the virus or not, with the health system or the government monitoring that. Will that be acceptable? Or will there be a backlash against technology? People are fed up of I spend my whole day now at work staring at this small screen. I have no other form of work. It's driving me crazy, so am I going to suddenly just want to not do it anymore? We don't know. So finally, ladies and gentlemen, I think obviously, as hopefully I've shown you, predictions are hard, but we can also see that some things are certain. It's absolutely true that the most adaptable brands and the most adaptable countries, and the Netherlands has always shown itself to be an incredibly adaptive country, those are the ones that are going to succeed, not necessarily the biggest as we come out of this. But we have lots of uncertainty. We know we already had agreement on climate emergency, but we didn't know what to do about it. We have data anxiety all over the world, but at the same time, rising apathy. We have the loss of the future across Europe and in America, but at the same time, and as part of that, then real challenges to elites. Does that mean that government now is finally going to step in to address that loss of the future in a collective way? We don't know. We have this sort of love of local provenance, and there's some interesting changes to supply chains happening as a result of the crisis, as distributors suddenly realize they can go direct to consumers locally, and you get all sorts of new players. Again, will that mean a challenge to global brands? We have that search for simplicity and health, but we have this rising hedonism trend. And we have authenticity, but also, of course, still that innate skepticism, the lack of deference. So brands can try and be authentic, but people are still always going to be skeptical about them, and that's that is still there. That's a very short and tour through the data. There is a lot more at the website. You can go there now, Ipsos Global Trends, and of course we're happy to answer any individual questions.